my basement? Yeah, there's a dark secret. But it isn't about the one I killed. It's about the one I was hunting.
Greetings, fellow seekers of the untold. I am the Archivist, and it is my privilege to welcome you back to my collection of stories that exist in the shadows of the ordinary. Every town has its secrets, every quiet street its whispers. But sometimes, the most profound and unsettling truths aren't found in the whispers between neighbors, but behind a single, unassuming front door. Today, we travel to the idyllic town of Maple Creek, a place so perfectly manicured it could be a movie set. A town of bake sales, block parties, and white picket fences. And in the heart of this town lived a man so ordinary he was practically invisible. His name was Arthur Finch, and the secret he kept locked away in his basement was about to tear Maple Creek's peaceful facade to pieces. The story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, polite knock. On a Tuesday afternoon, two detectives, a seasoned veteran named Miller and his younger, sharper partner Rossi, stood on the welcome mat of Arthur Finch's charming suburban home. They weren't there with sirens blazing. This wasn't a raid. It was, for all intents and purposes, a routine follow-up. A local college student, Leo Vance, had been missing for 3 weeks. His car had been found abandoned just a few miles away, on the edge of the woods that bordered Arthur's neighborhood. The police were canvassing, talking to everyone, chasing down whispers and dead ends. Arthur Finch was just another name on a very long list. When Arthur opened the door, he was everything they expected. A man in his mid-40s, wearing a neatly pressed polo shirt and a look of mild, courteous confusion. He was an accountant for a small firm downtown. He had a wife, Clara, a 4th-grade teacher, and 2 children, a son and a daughter, whose colorful drawings were taped to the refrigerator visible behind him. He invited the detectives in with a calm, almost placid demeanor. He offered them water. He was the picture of a cooperative citizen. Detective Miller, a man who had learned to trust his gut over 3 decades of police work, felt a strange, subtle hum of dissonance in the air. It wasn't anything he could articulate, not yet. It was just a feeling. Arthur Finch was too calm, too composed. Most people, even the completely innocent, show a flicker of anxiety when 2 detectives show up at their door asking about a missing person. But Arthur was a sea of tranquility. They sat in the living room, a space filled with family photos and comfortable furniture. Miller began the questioning, his voice casual. He asked Arthur if he'd seen or heard anything unusual around the time Leo Vance disappeared. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his expression one of sincere concentration. He recalled the day perfectly. He had left work at 5, picked up some supplies from the hardware store for a weekend project, and was home by 6:30. He had dinner with his family, helped his son with a science project, and watched a nature documentary with his wife. His timeline was precise, detailed, and utterly mundane. He even offered to show them the receipt from the hardware store, which he kept for his household budget spreadsheets. Rossi, ever the pragmatist, took notes, an accountant with a detailed alibi and a receipt. This felt like a dead end, but Miller watched Arthur's eyes. They never wavered. He answered every question without a hint of hesitation, his voice a steady, soothing monotone. It was the kind of performance an innocent man might give, but it was also the kind of performance a very practiced liar would perfect. There was no crack, no seam, no tell, and that to Miller was the biggest tell of all. They asked about the woods behind his house, the area where Leo's car was found. Had he been back there recently? Arthur shook his head. He rarely went into the woods, he explained. Ticks, poison ivy. Besides, he was busy. His garage needed organizing, a project he'd been planning for weeks. That was what the hardware store trip was for. Again, a perfectly reasonable, perfectly boring explanation. The detectives thanked him for his time and left. As they walked back to their car, Rossi closed his notebook. Well, that was a bust. The guy's a human spreadsheet. Nothing there. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling. He stared back at the house, a perfect little box in a row of perfect little boxes. I don't know, Rossi, he said, his voice low. It was too perfect. It was like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed 100 times. That single. Nagging doubt in Detective Miller's mind was the loose thread that would eventually unravel the entire, terrifying tapestry of Arthur Finch's life. He couldn't let it go. And so, the next day, they decided to circle back. This time, they wanted to speak with his wife, Clara, alone. They found Clara at the elementary school where she taught. She was warm and flustered, surrounded by the delightful chaos of children. She was a stark contrast to her husband's unnerving calm. When they asked her about the night Leo Vance disappeared, her story matched her husband's, but with the small, fuzzy imperfections of a real memory. She remembered the hardware store trip, yes. She remembered the nature documentary. But there was a small detail, a slight variance that made Detective Miller's ears perk up. She said Arthur had been agitated when he got home. He seemed distracted, on edge. He had gone straight down to the basement after dinner, which was unusual. He'd spent a couple of hours down there before coming up to watch television. When she asked what he was doing, he just said he was sorting through some old boxes, getting a head start on the garage project. It seemed plausible enough, so she hadn't thought much of it. But then came the second detail. The detectives asked her what he had purchased from the hardware store. She frowned, trying to remember. Oh, the usual stuff for his projects. He's always tinkering. I think he got some of those heavy-duty plastic ties. And a roll of that really thick industrial tape. He said it was for bundling old pipes in the garage. In the car, Rossi looked at Miller. Zip ties and duct tape. It's a classic kidnapper's toolkit, Miller nodded slowly. And he was agitated. He went straight to the basement. A basement he told us he was just using for storage. It still wasn't much. It was circumstantial, thin as smoke. But it was enough. The perfect alibi now had a stain on it. The image of the mild-mannered accountant was beginning to blur at the edges. Miller knew they needed more than a wife's vague recollections. They needed a reason to get inside that house again. A reason to get into that basement. They decided to do a more thorough search of the woods behind the Finch property. They brought in a canine unit. For hours, they found nothing but fallen leaves and discarded junk. But then, just as the sun began to dip below the trees, one of the dogs started barking insistently near a small, overgrown creek bed about 50 yards from Arthur's back fence. There, half buried in the mud, was a small dark button. It was a common type, but it matched the coat Leo Vance was last seen wearing. This was it. The link. It was tenuous, but it placed a piece of the victim's clothing within a stone's throw of Arthur Finch's home. It was enough for a judge. That evening, with a signed search warrant in hand, Miller and Rossi returned to the perfect little house on the quiet suburban street. This time, they weren't knocking politely. When Arthur Finch opened the door and saw the warrant, for the first time a flicker of something crossed his face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was resignation, as if he knew this moment was inevitable. He stepped aside without a word and let the uniformed officers and detectives stream into his home. Clara and the children were quickly escorted to a neighbor's house, their faces masks of confusion and fear. The search began. The house was, as expected, immaculate. The kitchen was spotless. The living room was tidy. The upstairs bedrooms were neat and orderly. There was nothing out of place, nothing to suggest a struggle or any kind of violence. It was a home frozen in a state of perfect domesticity. But the whole time, Miller was aware of one thing: a single locked door at the end of the hallway leading to the basement. Arthur sat at his dining room table, a uniformed officer standing nearby. He was silent, his hands resting on the table. His unnerving calm had returned, but now it felt different. It felt heavier, like the calm before a devastating storm. Finally, Miller and Rossi stood before the basement door. "Arthur!" Miller called out, his voice echoing in the quiet house. "We need the key to this door." Arthur didn't look up. "I'd prefer if you didn't go down there," he said, his voice flat. "That's not an option," Rossi stated, holding up a pair of bolt cutters. A long, heavy silence hung in the air. Then Arthur let out a soft sigh, a sound of profound weariness. "The key is on the hook by the fridge," he said. "There's no need to break the door." With a growing sense of dread, Rossi retrieved the key. The lock turned with a loud metallic click that seemed to punctuate the tension. Miller pushed the door open, revealing a steep, wooden staircase descending into darkness. He flicked a switch on the wall, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows below. The air that drifted up from the basement was cool and sterile, carrying the faint, clean scent of ozone, like after a thunderstorm. Miller and Rossi exchanged a look. This was the moment of truth. Gripping their flashlights, they started down the stairs, their footsteps echoing on the old wood. They expected the worst. A makeshift cell, a blood-stained floor, a shallow grave. They were prepared for a scene of unspeakable horror. But what they found at the bottom of the stairs was something far stranger, and in its own way, far more terrifying. The basement wasn't a dungeon. It was a command center. The space was meticulously organized, clean, and humming with the low thrum of electronics. Along one entire wall were 3 large computer monitors. Another wall was covered in a massive corkboard, intricately connected with a web of strings, photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. There was sophisticated radio equipment, police scanners, and audio filtering devices. It looked like a spy's hideout, something out of a movie. This wasn't the lair of a brutish killer. This was the workspace of a meticulous, obsessed, and highly intelligent operator. Miller and Rossi stood in stunned silence, their flashlights sweeping across the room. On the monitors, lines of code scrolled past, and complex tracking software was running. The corkboard was a chilling mosaic of information. There were multiple sections, each dedicated to a different person. Miller walked closer and saw that they were all missing persons cases from the last 10 years, some local, some from neighboring states. Cases that had long gone cold, and in the very center of the board, given the most prominence, was a new section. It was dedicated to Leo Vance. There were photos of him, a map tracking his last known movements, and detailed notes on his acquaintances and habits. But there was also information the police didn't have. Financial records they hadn't subpoenaed yet. Social media conversations from encrypted apps. It was a level of surveillance that went far beyond what law enforcement could legally do. What in the world was this? Was Arthur Finch a serial killer who obsessively stalked his victims? Was this a gallery of his trophies? It didn't make sense. The level of detail, the sheer volume of research. It was a full-time job, more than a full-time job. It was an obsession. What is all this, Arthur? Miller yelled up the stairs, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They heard footsteps, and moments later, Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs, flanked by an officer. He looked down at them, his face unreadable in the dim light. He walked slowly down the steps, his gaze sweeping over his secret world. Now exposed. This, Arthur said, his voice soft but clear, is my life's work. Rossi, still reeling, pointed a shaking finger at Leo Vance's section on the board. Did you do this? Did you kidnap him? Is this where you plan it all? Arthur slowly shook his head. He walked over to the board, his fingers gently tracing one of the strings connected to a photo of a young woman who had vanished 5 years earlier. I don't hurt people, detective, he said. I find the people who do. The statement hung in the air, so contrary to every assumption they had made. Miller stared at him, trying to process it. A vigilante? A basement-dwelling Batman in a polo shirt? It seemed absurd. Explain, Miller commanded. And so, the story of Arthur Finch finally came spilling out. It didn't begin with Leo Vance. It began 25 years earlier, with his younger sister, Sarah. She was 16 years old, bright and full of life, and one summer evening, she walked to a friend's house and never came back. The police investigated. They followed leads. They interviewed suspects, but the case grew cold. After a year, it was just another file in a cabinet, another unsolved tragedy. But Arthur never gave up. He was just a teenager then, but the event forged him. He saw the world differently. He saw the cracks, the predators lurking in the shadows that everyone else ignored. He went to college and studied accounting and data analysis, not because he was passionate about numbers, but because he saw them as a weapon. He learned to see patterns in data that others missed. He learned how to be invisible, how to gather information without leaving a trace. His quiet life, his boring job, his perfect family. It was all a magnificent, carefully constructed camouflage. By day, he was Arthur Finch, accountant. But by night, and in every spare moment, he was something else. He was a hunter. He used his skills to scour the dark corners of the internet, to track financial records, to piece together digital breadcrumbs. He built profiles of dangerous individuals, people the police didn't have the resources or the probable cause to investigate. He wasn't looking for his sister anymore. He knew deep down that she was gone forever. He was trying to stop it from happening to anyone else. The basement was his sanctuary, his mission control. Each section on the board was a case he was actively working, a person he was trying to save or a predator he was trying to expose. He would gather information, an overwhelming mountain of it, and then, when he was certain, he would send an anonymous, untraceable tip to the police or a journalist. He showed them a file on his computer. It was a list of tips he had sent over the years. Miller recognized 2 of them. 2 cold cases that had been suddenly and inexplicably solved by a mysterious, anonymous source. An abductor in a nearby state was caught because of a tip about his vehicle's unusual travel patterns. A ring of traffickers was broken up after an anonymous email detailed their financial transactions. It was him. It had been Arthur all along. The detectives were speechless. This mild-mannered man, this suburban father, had been waging a secret, one-man war from his basement. So what about Leo Vance? Rossi asked, his voice now laced with confusion instead of accusation. What happened to him? Arthur's face for the first time crumpled with genuine pain. A deep, soul-crushing guilt. I failed, he whispered. I was too late. He explained that for the past 6 months he had been tracking a man in their area, a handyman named Marcus Thorne. On the surface, Thorne was a normal guy. But Arthur's data analysis had flagged him. Small financial irregularities, a pattern of driving in odd looping routes late at night, a disturbing history of complaints from female clients that were individually dismissed but formed a terrifying pattern when viewed together. Arthur was building a case, waiting for the right moment to send his tip. Then, he noticed a connection. Leo Vance had recently hired Thorne to do some work at his off-campus apartment. Arthur's surveillance intensified. He saw Thorne taking an unusual interest in Leo, driving by his apartment, tracking his schedule. He knew Thorne was going to make a move. He felt it. The night Leo disappeared, Arthur was monitoring them both. He saw from traffic camera data and cell phone pings that Thorne was following Leo. Arthur left his house in a panic. That was his hardware store trip. It was a cover. He was racing to intercept Thorne, to stop whatever was about to happen. The items he bought, the zip ties and tape, weren't for kidnapping. They were for subduing Thorne if he had to. But there was traffic. A fender bender on the main road. He was delayed by 12 crucial minutes. By the time he got to the stretch of road where Leo's car was eventually found, it was already empty. Thorne and Leo were gone. Arthur had searched the area frantically. That's when the button from Leo's coat must have fallen off near his property. He had come back home, defeated. His agitation, the time he spent in the basement, it wasn't the work of a kidnapper covering his tracks. It was the frantic, desperate effort of a failed savior, poring over his data, trying to figure out where Thorne could have taken Leo. He pointed to a smaller, secondary board in the corner of the basement. It was covered with maps of abandoned properties, old quarries, and secluded cabins within a 50-mile radius of Maple Creek. It was a list of potential locations. "Thorne has a history with old industrial sites," Arthur explained, his voice gaining a frantic urgency. "He used to work for a demolition company. There's an abandoned textile mill about 30 miles from here. It's isolated. No cell service. I think that's where he is. I'm almost certain." Miller and Rossi stared at each other. The entire case had been flipped on its head. Their prime suspect wasn't a monster. He was something else entirely. A broken, obsessed man who had bent and shattered the law in the name of a justice he felt the world had denied him. His methods were illegal, the surveillance, the hacking, but his information could save a young man's life. There was no time for protocol. Miller got on his radio, his voice firm and clear. He relayed the address of the abandoned mill, citing a new lead from a confidential informant. He requested immediate backup, SWAT, everything they had, while they waited for confirmation that units were en route. Arthur Finch, the quiet accountant, stood before his massive wall of secrets, now fully exposed. He wasn't a monster in the way they had thought, but a man who lives in the shadows for so long, a man so consumed by the darkness he hunts. Can he ever truly be called innocent? His obsession had cost him his anonymity, and it was about to cost him his freedom. He had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. The raid on the abandoned textile mill went exactly as Arthur had predicted. They found Marcus Thorne's vehicle hidden in an old loading bay. Inside the cavernous, decaying building, they found Leo Vance. He was alive, bound and terrified, but alive. Thorne was taken into custody, completely blindsided. He never imagined anyone could have possibly connected him to the crime. Back at the Finch house, the news came over the radio. A wave of relief washed over the detectives. But then they looked at Arthur. He showed no joy, only a profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. He had succeeded, but the cost was immeasurable. The aftermath was complex. Arthur Finch was arrested. The charges were serious: obstruction of justice, illegal surveillance, wiretapping. His secret life was splashed across the news. The town of Maple Creek was in shock. The quiet accountant, the friendly neighbor, was a vigilante mastermind. Some called him a hero. Others called him a menace, a man who took the law into his own hands. His family was devastated, struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the stranger who had lived a double life in their basement. But the case against him was complicated. His illegal evidence had led directly to the rescue of Leo Vance and the capture of a dangerous predator. The district attorney was in a bind. Prosecuting Arthur to the full extent of the law would be a public relations nightmare. So, a deal was struck. Arthur Finch pleaded guilty to lesser charges. He served no jail time, but was given a lengthy sentence of probation and community service. His command center was dismantled, his equipment seized. He was legally barred from ever engaging in his clandestine activities again. But the story doesn't quite end there. Detective Miller, nearing retirement, never forgot what he saw in that basement. He saw a brilliant mind, warped by tragedy, but driven by a fierce, albeit misguided, sense of justice. A few months after the trial, Miller made an unofficial visit to Arthur's house. He offered him a way to use his gifts for good, legally this time. He could work as an anonymous, unpaid consultant for the cold case division, a special advisor whose data analysis skills could be put to use under the strict supervision of law enforcement. And so, a new chapter began. Arthur Finch never went back to his basement command center. He didn't need to. He could now do his life's work from a simple laptop at his dining room table, helping to find the patterns that others missed, bringing closure to families who had lost hope, just as his own family had so many years ago. The secret was out, but in its place, a strange and complicated redemption began to grow. The perfect house in Maple Creek still stands, but it's no longer just a symbol of suburban tranquility. It's a reminder that the most ordinary-seeming people can carry the most extraordinary secrets, and that the line between a hero and a villain is sometimes as thin and as tangled as a web of strings on a corkboard in a dark, quiet basement. Thank you for joining me in the archives today. The story of Arthur Finch is a testament to the complex nature of justice and the depths of human obsession. What do you think? Was he a hero who broke the rules for the right reasons, or a dangerous man who simply got lucky? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The truth is rarely simple, and it is in these gray areas that the most compelling stories are found. Until next time, stay curious, and remember to look for the stories hidden just beneath the surface. I am the Archivist, and I will be waiting for you.